I opened the door and froze. Jason stood there, soaked, desperate, and different. My heart raced. "What are you doing here?" I whispered, feeling torn between loyalty and an undeniable pull. The knock on the door startled me. It was late, and the storm outside raged with a ferocity that mirrored the restless emotions swirling in my chest. When I opened it, Jason stood there, drenched from head to toe, rain dripping from his dark hair onto his chiseled jawline. His usual confident smirk was gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. My breath caught as I stepped aside, letting him into the warmth of the house. The space between us suddenly felt smaller, charged, as though the storm outside had followed him in. I tried to tell myself it was just Jason, Mark's best friend, the man who had been a part of our lives for years. But as the door clicked shut behind him, I knew everything was about to change. The sound of the knock startled me from my thoughts. I hesitated. It was late and I wasn't expecting anyone. Peeking through the window, I saw Jason standing there, his hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. Something about the way he looked, a mix of frustration and something softer, made me pause. "Jason?" I opened the door cautiously. "What are you doing here?" He shook his head, water droplets flying from his dark hair. "Sorry to show up like this, but my car broke down a few streets away and my phone died. I didn't know where else to go." "Oh." I glanced behind him, noting the rain pouring in sheets. "Well, come in before you catch your death out there." Jason stepped inside, and I closed the door behind him. The space suddenly felt smaller, the air charged with an energy I couldn't place. His presence, though familiar, now carried a weight I wasn't used to. "Thanks," he said, peeling off his drenched jacket. Beneath it, his t-shirt clung to his chest, revealing the toned muscles of someone who worked hard to stay fit. "I didn't mean to bother you." "It's no bother," I replied quickly, my voice higher than I intended. "Mark's not here, though. He's out of town." Jason nodded, running a hand through his wet hair. "Yeah, I figured. You're okay with me staying for a bit, right? I'll call for a tow once my phone charges." "Of course," I said, ignoring the pang in my chest at how eagerly I offered. "Let me grab you a towel." I hurried to the linen closet, using the moment to steady my breathing. It was just Jason, I told myself. Jason, who had been in our lives for years. But the truth gnawed at me. Lately I had noticed him in ways I shouldn't. The way his laugh lingered in my mind longer than it should, or how his compliments made my stomach flare. Returning with a towel, I found Jason standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the rain. His broad shoulders were tense, and when he turned to take the towel from me, our hands brushed. A spark, a small, dangerous thing, ignited in that fleeting touch. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice low. He began drying his hair, and I forced myself to look away, pretending to busy myself with cleaning the counter. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing second. "I can make some tea," I offered, my voice breaking the quiet. "Or coffee if you'd prefer." "Tea sounds good," he said, settling onto one of the bar stools by the kitchen island. He watched me as I moved, his gaze steady and piercing. It made my hands unsteady as I filled the kettle. "You've been okay?" he asked after a moment, his tone gentle. I glanced over my shoulder, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean, with Mark being gone so often, I know he's busy with work, but it must be hard." I hesitated, not sure how to answer. It was the kind of question Mark never asked. "It's fine," I said finally. "I'm used to it." Jason frowned, leaning forward, resting his arms on the counter. "You shouldn't have to be." His words hung in the air, a truth I hadn't dared to admit to myself. The kettle whistled, snapping me back to reality. I busied myself pouring the tea, hoping the simple act would drown out the thoughts swirling in my head. As I handed him his mug, our fingers brushed again. This time, neither of us pulled away immediately. His touch lingered, warm and grounding, and I felt the air between us shift. I quickly stepped back, clutching my own mug like a lifeline. "So, what happened with your car?" I asked, forcing a lightness into my voice. Jason smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "The rain flooded the engine, I think. I'll get it sorted tomorrow. Tonight, I just needed to get somewhere dry." "Well, you're welcome to stay," I said, trying to sound casual. "We have a guest room." "Thanks," he said, his voice softer now. "Really, I appreciate it." The storm outside raged on, but the tension in the kitchen was its own force of nature. Jason's gaze lingered on me longer than it should have, and I felt myself being pulled into something I didn't fully understand, something I wasn't sure I could resist. Jason's gratitude was evident as I handed him a fresh blanket and pointed him toward the guest room down the hall. His presence lingered even after he disappeared behind the door, leaving me alone in the stillness of the living room. I settled onto the couch, holding my tea, but my thoughts were a storm far louder than the rain battering the windows. Why did it feel different having him here tonight? Jason had been over countless times before. Dinners, poker nights with Mark, even casual Sunday afternoons when we all watched football together. But this was different. It was just the two of us. And for reasons I didn't want to name, my heart wouldn't stop racing. I stared into the fireplace, where embers from a previous evening's fire still glowed faintly. A flicker of guilt warmed my cheeks. Why was I even thinking about this? Jason was Mark's best friend, practically family. But as much as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, subtle as it had been over the years, now roaring louder with each passing moment. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, cutting through the gray skies left by last night's storm. I groggily made my way to the kitchen, only to find Jason already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. "Morning," he greeted, his smile warm and relaxed, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Morning," I replied, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "Did you sleep okay?" "Better than I have in weeks," he admitted. "Thanks again for letting me crash here." "Of course, it's no trouble," I smiled, though the ease of the conversation felt like a facade. Beneath the words, there was an unspoken energy between us that neither of us acknowledged directly. Jason gestured toward the coffee maker. "I made a pot. Hope that's okay." "More than okay," I said, grabbing a mug and pouring myself a cup. The warmth of the coffee steadied my hands, though my heart remained unsteady. Jason's phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up, glancing at the screen before letting out a small sigh. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Yeah, just work stuff. I've got to handle some things remotely later today." He set the phone down, then looked at me, his expression shifting slightly. "How about you? What's on your agenda?" "Nothing exciting," I said with a shrug. "Mark usually takes care of the errands on weekends, but since he's away, I'll probably tackle a few things myself." Jason's gaze softened. "You take on too much, you know that." The comment caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you do everything. Mark's always traveling, and you're the one keeping the house running, I've noticed." My throat tightened. It's just how things are. He works hard to provide for us. Jason shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It shouldn't all fall on you, though. You deserve more than that." His words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know how to respond. For years, I had convinced myself that Mark's work trips, his distractions, his absence, they were all sacrifices we made as a team. But hearing someone else say it aloud made the cracks in my logic impossible to ignore. "You don't mind," I said softly, though the words felt hollow. Jason leaned against the counter, studying me with those piercing eyes. You should mind. You deserve to feel seen, appreciated. Heat rose to my cheeks and I turned away, pretending to fuss with the dishes in the sink. His words cut too close to the truths I avoided confronting. I didn't trust myself to say anything more, so I busied myself in silence. The day passed in a haze of errands and chores. Jason offered to help, insisting on coming with me to the grocery store and carrying the heavy bags into the house. I didn't protest. His company was a welcome distraction from the whirlwind of emotions churning inside me. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves in the living room. Jason had spread out a few documents on the coffee table, working through whatever crisis his job demanded. I sat nearby, folding laundry. It was strangely domestic, this rhythm we had fallen into, and it tugged at something deep within me. Do you ever feel lonely? The question tumbled from my lips before I could stop it. Jason looked up, surprised. What do you mean? I hesitated, fumbling for an explanation. I mean, with work and life in general, do you ever feel like something's missing? He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, more often than I'd like to admit. He paused, his eyes meeting mine. What about you? The honesty in his voice made my chest tighten. I wanted to brush the question off, to give some superficial answer, but the weight of his gaze pulled the truth from me. Sometimes, I admitted. I don't think Mark even notices when I'm upset anymore. It's like we're living separate lives under the same roof. Jason's jaw tightened and he looked away, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a document. That's not fair to you. I let out a humorless laugh. Life's not exactly fair, is it? Maybe not, he said quietly, but you deserve better than that. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the unsaid words hovering in the air between us, heavy and charged. Jason's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he looked back down at his work. By evening, the storm clouds had returned, casting the house in a somber gray light. Jason offered to cook dinner, and I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, watching as he moved around the space with an ease that felt intimate. You're pretty good at this, I remarked as he chopped vegetables with practiced precision. I've had a lot of practice, he said with a small smile. When you live alone, you learn to fend for yourself. I nodded, taking a sip of wine. It must get lonely. Jason paused, his knife stilling on the cutting board. It does, but then I think about how much harder it must be for you. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. You're not alone, but you're lonely. That's worse. His words struck a nerve, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. I looked away, pretending to adjust the salt shaker on the table. You don't have to say things like that. But it's true, he said softly. I see you, you know, the way Mark doesn't. And He stopped himself, biting back whatever words had been on the tip of his tongue. The moment stretched between us, electric and dangerous, until the sound of rain on the windows broke the spell. Dinner was a quiet affair. Jason and I sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the dim overhead light casting soft shadows across the room. The rain tapped rhythmically against the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy around us. We talked about light things at first. Work, mutual friends, memories of Mark during their college days. But the undercurrent of tension was undeniable. Every glance felt like a question, every smile a confession neither of us dared to voice. You've outdone yourself, I said, gesturing to the plate of pasta Jason had prepared. I'm going to have to keep you around for cooking lessons. He chuckled, his grin boyish and warm. Careful, I might take you up on that. There it was again, that spark. I looked away quickly, my heart racing. This wasn't right. I was married. Jason was my husband's best friend. But no matter how many times I reminded myself of the boundaries, they felt increasingly fragile. The wine had loosened my tongue, and before I could stop myself, I said, "Why don't you ever settle down, Jason? Someone like you shouldn't be single." He hesitated, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "It's complicated," he said finally, setting the utensil down. His eyes met mine, searching. "The truth is, I've never found anyone who feels right." "Come on," I said, forcing a playful tone. "That's hard to believe. You're smart, funny, and not to mention—" I trailed off, blushing. Jason arched a brow, a sly smile tugging at his lips. "Not to mention what?" "Nothing," I said quickly, focusing on my plate. "You can say it," he teased, leaning back in his chair. "I'm a big boy. I can take a compliment." I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "Forget it." But Jason didn't. He studied me for a long moment, his expression softening. "Why are you so hard on yourself?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm not," I replied, though the defensiveness in my voice betrayed me. "You are," he insisted. "You downplay everything about yourself, like you don't even realize how incredible you are. It drives me crazy." The air seemed to thicken between us. I felt pinned by his gaze, unable to look away. His words hung in the space between us, raw and honest, cutting through every wall I'd built around my emotions. "Jason," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't." "Why not?" he asked, his voice low and steady. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Tell me why I shouldn't say it." "Because it's not fair," I said, my throat tightening. "Not to Mark, not to you." "And what about you?" he pressed, his eyes burning into mine. "Is it fair to you to keep pretending you're happy when you're not?" I felt the tears welling up, hot and unstoppable. "This isn't about me," I said weakly. "It should be," he said, his voice softening. "You deserve to be happy too." The sound of rain filled the silence that followed, the steady rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. Jason reached across the table, his hand hovering just above mine. I didn't move. I couldn't. When his fingers finally brushed against mine, it was like a dam breaking. Every unspoken word, every repressed feeling surged to the surface. "Jason," I started, but the words caught in my throat. "Say the word," he murmured, "and I'll stop. Just say it, and I'll never bring this up again." I stared at him, torn between the life I had built and the temptation sitting right in front of me. My lips parted, but no sound came out. The silence was my answer, and Jason took it as permission. We moved almost instinctively, as if drawn by a force neither of us could resist. Jason stood, walking around the table to stand in front of me. My breath hitched as he reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered against my cheek, sending shivers down my spine. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do this," he whispered. Before I could respond, his lips were on mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as though he was giving me a chance to pull away, but when I didn't, it deepened, and all the restraint we'd clung to evaporated. His hands cradled my face, his touch both tender and commanding. I melted into him, my heart pounding in my chest. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless. Jason's forehead rested against mine, his eyes searching mine for any hint of regret. "Tell me to leave," he said, his voice hoarse. "And I will." But I didn't tell him to leave. Instead, I pulled him closer, my hands gripping the front of his shirt as though letting go would mean losing something vital. His arms wrapped around me, strong and steady, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly seen. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of stolen moments and whispered confessions. Jason and I moved through the house as if it were ours alone, untethered by the rules and expectations that had governed our lives for so long. In his arms, I found a freedom I hadn't realized I was craving, a warmth that filled every empty space inside me. But as the storm outside began to wane, so did the illusion of safety. Reality crept back in, its shadow looming over us like a dark cloud. Jason lay beside me on the couch, his arm draped protectively around my shoulders. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Jason tightened his hold on me, his lips brushing against my temple. "That's up to you." His answer, though honest, offered no comfort. My mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to face. What would Mark think if he found out? Could I live with myself knowing I had betrayed him? And yet, as I lay there in Jason's arms, the thought of going back to the way things were felt unbearable. The rain had stopped by the time Jason finally stood to leave. He looked at me with an expression that was equal parts longing and sorrow, as though he already knew this would be the last time. "If you need me," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "you know where to find me." I nodded, unable to speak. He lingered for a moment longer, then turned and walked out the door. As I watched him disappear into the night, a hollow ache settled in my chest. I knew nothing would ever be the same. The morning after, the sunlight streamed through the windows, its warmth mocking the cold knot in my stomach. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the night before. Jason's touch, his words, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. It was all still vivid, etched into my skin like a secret I couldn't wash away. But the weight of what I had done pressed down on me, suffocating. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was a woman who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The sound of my phone buzzing snapped me out of my thoughts. I reached for it hesitantly, half expecting Jason's name to flash across the screen. But it wasn't Jason. It was Mark. "Hey," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Morning," Mark said, his tone light and familiar. "Just checking in. How's everything going at home?" "Everything?" The word hung in the air like a taunt. Everything was far from okay, but I forced a smile he couldn't see. "It's fine. How's the conference?" "Boring as hell," he said with a chuckle. "I'll be wrapping up sooner than expected, though. I should be home by tonight." Tonight. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. "That's great," I managed to say, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "I can't wait to see you," he added, his tone softening. "It feels like it's been forever." My chest tightened with guilt. "Same here," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. Mark was coming home, and I had no idea how I was supposed to face him. My betrayal was still fresh, the memory of Jason's touch lingering like a ghost in the room. I spent the day cleaning the house, though it was already spotless. I needed something to do, something to distract myself from the turmoil inside me, but no matter how hard I scrubbed or how many times I rearranged the same vase of flowers, I couldn't escape the reality of what I'd done. The sound of the doorbell jolted me from my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat as I approached the door, half expecting Jason to be standing there. But it wasn't Jason. It was Mark. "Surprise," he said, grinning as he stepped inside, dropping his suitcase by the door. I caught an earlier flight. I forced a smile, my heart pounding in my chest. "Welcome home." He leaned in to kiss me, and I let him, though the warmth of his lips only deepened my guilt. As he pulled away, he frowned slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. "Of course," I said quickly, stepping back to put some space between us. "I'm just tired. It's It's been a long week. Mark nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. Well, why don't we take it easy tonight? Order some takeout, watch a movie. Just the two of us. Sounds perfect, I said, my voice strained. The weight of my secret pressed heavier with each passing moment. Later that evening, as we sat together on the couch, Mark's arm draped casually around my shoulders, I found myself flinching at his touch. He didn't seem to notice, his attention focused on the movie playing on the screen. But I couldn't concentrate. All I could think about was Jason. Mark shifted slightly, pulling me closer. "You've been quiet," he said, glancing at me. "Is something on your mind?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "Just tired, like I said earlier." He frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. "You sure? You've seemed distant lately." The words hit too close to home, and I felt a pang of panic. "I'm fine, Mark, really." He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded, though the doubt in his eyes lingered. "All right," he said softly. "But if something's bothering you, you can tell me. You know that, right?" I nodded, but the words felt hollow. How could I tell him the truth? How could I look him in the eye and admit that I had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way? As the days passed, Mark's presence became both a comfort and a reminder of my guilt. He was attentive, more so than he had been in months, as though he sensed that something was wrong. He brought me coffee in the mornings, left little notes for me to find throughout the day, and even canceled a business trip to spend more time at home. I should have felt grateful, but instead his kindness only deepened the chasm between us. The harder he tried to bridge the distance, the more I pulled away, unable to reconcile the man he was with the betrayal I had committed. Jason, meanwhile, was a ghost in the back of my mind. He hadn't called or texted since that night, and I hadn't reached out to him either, but his absence didn't lessen his presence in my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice, felt his touch. One evening, as Mark and I sat at the dinner table, he put his fork down and looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "Something's going on," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And I need you to be honest with me." My heart raced, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean?" "You've been different lately," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Distant, distracted. It's like you're here but not really here. And I don't know what to do about it." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but everything sounded hollow and unconvincing. "Is it something I've done?" Mark asked, his voice softer now. "If it is, just tell me. I can fix it." "It's not you," I said quickly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "You haven't done anything wrong." "Then what is it?" he pressed, his frustration evident. "Because I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't even know why." The pain in his voice cut through me like a knife. He deserved the truth, but the thought of saying it out loud, of shattering the life we had built together, was unbearable. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I don't know what's wrong." Mark reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it," he said softly. "But I need you to let me in, please." Tears welled in my eyes, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I need some air," I whispered, pulling my hand away and standing up. "I'm sorry." I didn't wait for his response. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the cool night air biting against my skin. My thoughts were a whirlwind, the weight of my choices pressing down on me with unbearable force. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know if it could be fixed. I stood outside, staring up at the night sky as the cool breeze carried the scent of fall. The stars seemed indifferent to my turmoil, twinkling as if nothing in the world could disturb their quiet existence. I wished I could feel that kind of peace, but my chest felt heavy with the weight of my guilt and the unraveling of my carefully constructed life. I didn't know how long I stood there before I heard the creak of the front door behind me. Mark stepped out, his footsteps deliberate but hesitant, as though he wasn't sure whether to approach me. "Do you want to talk?" he asked softly, his voice tentative. I wrapped my arms around myself, more to hold myself together than to block out the cold. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark walked over and stood beside me, his hands in his pockets. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't need you to have all the answers," he said finally. "I just need you to be honest with me." His words, so earnest and full of hope, cut through me like a blade. I wanted to tell him everything, to unburden myself of the secret that had been eating away at me since Jason walked out that night. But I couldn't. The truth would destroy him, and it would destroy us. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice trembling. "There are things I stopped myself, shaking my head. "I don't know how to explain it." Mark turned to face me, his expression pained but patient. "Then start with what you can. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." I looked at him, this man who had shared my life for so many years, and felt the full weight of what I had done. Mark wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve my silence or the betrayal I had committed in the arms of someone he trusted. "I've been feeling lost," I said finally, the words tumbling out clumsily, like I'm not enough or that I've been forgotten, and I don't know how to fix it. Mark's face softened, and he stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice laced with regret. "If you were feeling this way, why didn't you talk to me?" "Because you're never here," I said, the frustration and pain spilling out before I could stop it. "You're always gone, on trips, at work, chasing something I'm not a part of. And I've been trying to convince myself that it's okay, that I'm okay. But I'm not." Mark's hand fell away, and he took a step back, his jaw tightening. "I didn't realize," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I was doing the right thing, working hard to give us a good life. I didn't see how much it was costing you." "It's not just you," I said quickly, guilt flooding back into my chest. "It's me too. I let it build up instead of saying something. I let myself believe that this is just how things are supposed to be." Mark's eyes met mine, and I saw the pain there, the realization that things had been broken for far longer than either of us had been willing to admit. "Do you still want this?" he asked quietly. His question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of our shared history. Did I? The thought of losing him, of tearing apart everything we'd built, felt unbearable. But so did the idea of continuing to live with this secret festering between us. "I don't know," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know how to fix this." Mark nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Then we figure it out together," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes, we figure it out." The days that followed were a strange mix of tension and tentative hope. Mark made a conscious effort to be more present, taking time off work and planning small moments for the two of us. Dinners at home, walks in the park, even lazy mornings spent sipping coffee together on the porch. It was almost enough to make me believe we could find our way back to each other. And that night, Thomas. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on rebuilding our marriage, the memory of Jason lingered like a shadow. I hadn't heard from him since that night, and part of me was grateful. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened when he wasn't around. But another part of me, the part I hated to acknowledge, missed him. One evening, while Mark was out running errands, I found myself scrolling through old messages on my phone. My finger hovered over Jason's name, the temptation to reach out almost overwhelming. I wanted to know how he was, whether he regretted what had happened as much as I did, or if he didn't regret it at all. I didn't realize I had started typing a message until the screen lit up with his name. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I just stared at the notification. Jason, I hope you're okay. My hands trembled as I typed out a reply. I'm fine. You? His response came almost immediately. I miss you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew I shouldn't respond, but the ache in my chest won out over my better judgment. Jason, I can't do this. His reply was slower this time, as though he was weighing every word. I know. But I needed you to know how I feel. I'll leave you alone if that's what you want. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Did I want him to leave me alone? Or did I want something I couldn't allow myself to have? Before I could overthink it, I typed out a single word. Goodbye. I set the phone down, my chest heaving as though I had just run a marathon. Saying goodbye to Jason felt like cutting off a part of myself, but it was the only way forward. I couldn't live in the shadow of what had happened. I had to choose. Mark, my marriage, my life as it was, or the chaos and uncertainty of something I could never fully have. When Mark came home that night, he kissed me on the forehead and told me he loved me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't flinch. I wrapped my arms around him, holding on tightly, as though I could will myself to believe that everything would be okay. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, could I ever truly let Jason go? Or would he always be the secret I carried, tucked away in the quiet corners of my heart? Jason, Mark said, his grin widening. He was at the gym. We caught up for a bit. It's been forever since I've seen him. My stomach tightened. Oh, I said softly, forcing a smile. That's nice. Yeah, it was great. Mark continued, oblivious to my discomfort. I invited him over for dinner tomorrow. Figured it'd be good for all of us to hang out like old times. My heart dropped. Tomorrow? Yeah, he said he'd love to. I told him we'd keep it casual, just a simple meal and some drinks. After dinner, Mark excused himself to take a work call, leaving Jason and me alone in the living room. The silence between us was deafening, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on both of us. How have you been? Jason asked finally, his voice low. I'm fine, I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. You? He hesitated, then nodded. Fine, he echoed, though the word felt hollow. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I didn't think I'd see you again. I didn't think so either, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But here we are. Jason studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. My breath caught in my throat. Jason, don't. Do you? He pressed, his eyes searching mine. Because I don't. His words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. I stood abruptly, my hands clenching at my sides. We can't do this, I said, my voice trembling. Not here, not now. Jason stood as well, his expression pained. I know, he said softly, but that doesn't mean I don't think about it, about you. I looked away, my heart pounding. You need to leave, I said, my voice breaking. Please, Jason. He hesitated, his jaw tightening, but then he nodded. All right, he said quietly, I'll go. Mark returned just as Jason was putting on his jacket. Leaving already? He asked, frowning. Eh? Jason said, forcing a smile. Early morning tomorrow, but thanks for having me, man. It was good to catch up. Mark clapped him on the back. Any time, don't be a stranger. Jason glanced at me one last time before stepping out the door, his eyes filled with a longing that made my chest ache. I watched him go, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in my ears. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Jason's words replayed in my head, mingling with the sound of his voice and the memory of his touch. I knew I had made the right decision by ending things, but the ache in my heart told a different story. Mark stirred beside me, reaching out to pull me closer. I nestled into his embrace, willing myself to focus on the warmth of his arms and the steady rhythm of his breathing. This was my life. This was where I belonged. But deep down I knew the memory of Jason would always linger, a quiet reminder of a moment that had changed everything. As I closed my eyes, I made a silent promise to myself to focus on the life I had chosen and to let go of the one I hadn't.